title of this short presentation is Mandatory Labeling of Animal Welfare Attributes, Public Support and Consideration for Policymakers. There's been lots of work done by economists like myself that are looking into the growing interest consumers are expressing into how their food's produced. One of the notable points of that discussion is the U.S. consumers are increasingly interested in how livestock being raised for eventual meat, milk, and egg consumption and production of those products for eventual consumption are handled, right? And animal welfare is a general term that's used to summarize that. Really what that's getting at is the care and handling of the livestock that are being raised and reared for eventual, as I said, meat, milk, or egg production. Other videos are out there that have summarized state-by-state changes that have went underway over the last half dozen years or so. Ballot initiatives, state legislature changes, so forth, that all have to do with individual restrictions on given production practices. The issue of gestation stalls and swine production, and laying hen cages and egg production are the two most commonly discussed practices. As a result of those state-by-state changes, there's been some increasing calls to quote-unquote level the field, because producers in different states increasingly are operating a patchwork system where you have different advantages or disadvantages of operating in one state. For instance, if you're operating in California after January 1st, 2015, when Prop 2 would come into play, you might be at a disadvantage to being in a different state. So those kind of things have led to more discussions that get to national level issues. And notably, last week, on July 7th, United Egg Producers and the Humane Society of the United States announced an agreement and have in turn called for federal legislation that would establish national standards regarding housing of laying hens, as well as, and this is the first note of this as well, calls for mandatory labeling of egg products that would convey to consumers information about housing that's used. So that particular recent news point is timely. It's motivation for this particular video where I'm going to summarize a very related study. In particular, not too long ago, completed a study in collaboration with Chris Wolf, an economist at Michigan State University, when we had two main objectives in that study. One was to examine resident support for mandatory labeling of animal welfare information on pork and eggs, very similar related to what UEP and HSUS agreement just got to related to eggs. Secondly, the hope of that study was to outline some consideration for assessment prior to implementing mandatory labeling policies. The hope of this video is to roll out and summarize that particular study. More details are available elsewhere, but to particularly highlight what we found and what we think should be on the table for discussion before any mandatory labeling goes into place. Real quick, methods-wise, we did a survey at the end of 2008. It was right around the time of the Prop 2 vote in California as a background for this particular national survey. That's nationally representative in terms of typical socioeconomic characteristics and so forth. And we were looking at general awareness and perceptions with respect to animal welfare. And notably for this particular presentation, we estimated demand and support for mandatory labeling of animal welfare information on pork and egg products. There's a kind of a summary of some of our results. About 62% said they're in favor of mandatory labeling of pork that would indicate if gestation crates or stalls and crates are used synonymously here are used, as well as about 62% were in favor of mandatory labeling indicating if laying hen cages were used on egg products. However, importantly, we followed up that question where we allowed, or basically put them in a situation to where either pork or egg prices adjusted, and 44% of those folks removed their support once it was conveyed there might be a retail price impact. Going further, we estimated what we call demand for mandatory labeling of animal welfare information on these two products, and we estimated about 20% higher prices might be supported. That is, the average person might be willing to pay 20% higher pork or egg prices for this information. However, to be fair, to criticize our own work, this work uses what's called stated preference methods that are known to be subject to hypothetical bias, and hence this 20% is likely an upper bound on the true estimate. That's not to say it's not useful. It is the first estimate that we're aware of, so we offer it out there as part of this information set that should be noted, but replication on this is needed. Another thing we did was we looked at what drives support for mandatory labeling and demand to absorb higher prices, and a key thing we found was perceived accuracy of animal welfare information from livestock industries relative to consumer groups was a critical driver. If a particular respondent thought livestock industries provided accurate information, they were notably less supportive of mandatory labeling, and they were willing to pay a lower price for that thing, or that particular policy. However, if they thought consumer groups were particularly more accurate in the animal welfare information that they rolled out, they were more supportive of mandatory labeling, and they revealed they were willing to pay a higher price. Now, I noted the second objective was to outline some considerations before mandatory labeling is implemented. You'll see here I've underlined, italicized, and bolded the pre in the title here because I sincerely hope these things are given consideration before anything goes forward. But what we highlight in this particular study is a host of things that need to be considered. First, economists are big believers that benefit cost assessments are needed. There's not been one done to our knowledge on this particular issue. We highly encourage that be done. Secondly, a lot of delineations are needed. The distinction between frequent consumers of, in this case, pork or egg products, and advocates for changes that may be voters that are less frequent meat, milk, or egg consumers needs to be noted. At the heart of that is you're going to have different economic impacts on residents, consumers throughout the entire country, depending on where you fall on the spectrums. And then the flip of that would be producer impacts likely vary within industries. So the impacts for egg, pork, or other livestock species likely vary, and then within each species, the impacts likely vary. I mean, if you're an egg producer in California that's currently faced with the fact that Prop 2 passed in 2008, the impacts of this potential change are likely different than if you're sitting in, say, Iowa, where no such thing has went forth so forth. Likewise, there's probably different economies of scale issues, different specialization issues, a whole host of things. So we encourage getting away from homogeneous producer impact kind of assumptions. Third, alternative voluntary labeling issues or approaches warrant consideration. One of the concerns with mandatory labeling is potentially consumer choices may not be enhanced. The industry may actually, obviously comply with mandatory labeling regulation, but the diversity of products might actually decrease. So a voluntary labeling scheme might help resolve some of that. That's not to say that's better, but it warrants fair consideration. Information overload by consumers warrants additional discussion. I frequently note that there is no such thing as full information on a product. You can't put every detail about how food is produced and all the details about production practices, where it's produced, so forth, on a product. And at some point, the consumer faces overload. There's too much information provided to them. And serious discussion about if and when we get to that point warrants evaluation before policies go forward. And lastly, I at least personally think more consideration, discussion needs to be given to development of what I'll call a composite animal welfare index. Hopefully you found this summary useful. There's more details. Besides this particular video, there's a 3-page fact sheet, the full journal article study, as well as related details can all be found on agmanager.info. Thank you for your time.